On the night of June 17th, 1953, the hard-packed dirt field behind South High School in Springfield, Ohio, seemed smaller than usual, as if it had been pushed inward between the chain-link fence and the dark cutout of trees that sloped down toward the Mad River Valley. The fence, patched here and there with newer wire and crooked staples, no longer held balls well, and the lights mounted on wooden poles, bare bulbs and simple floodlight housings, with exposed wiring, shivered in the warm, humid wind typical of early summer in the valley. Even so, the amateur softball team, wearing gray shirts with blue letters, Warden and Sons Tool, took the field knowing that this game was not only about the score. If they lost the sponsor that week, they would also lose the new leather-covered balls that cost more than people thought, the borrowed bus for games in Urbana and Dayton, and even the space on the field itself, sustained by a good neighbor agreement with the school district and the Veterans Club on the corner of Limestone Street, where informal permissions at nighttime use always ran up against keys, schedules, and electricity bills. The logic was direct and hard. Without money, the team fell apart. Without the team, some boys would go back to drifting through the nights, and the younger ones coming up from the feeder group would be left without a place to run when the heat pressed in and the houses felt too full. With open windows, tabletop fans, and families sharing rooms in neighborhoods where rent and installment payments weighed like a second shift. The bleachers were short, planks set on blocks, with exposed nails and old rain stains. There were women in light cotton dresses, and men in work shirts that still smelled of oil and solvent, some arriving straight from their shift with no time to change. The sound of the game mixed with the distant hum of U.S. Route 40, a route always busy with cars and trucks crossing the state, and with each harder hit of fine, dust rose that stuck to sweat and got into eyes. Near the dugout, Tomas Tom Sikora tightened his cap with both hands and watched the pitcher warm up, repeating the motion with the regularity of someone who had learned, in practice, to conserve effort. He was the coach, but he was not paid. By day, he worked at International Harvester on the assembly line in a routine of siren, time clock, and pace supervision, and at night he did what he could to keep the boys together and out of trouble. He was 34, with thick hands calloused by metal and grease that did not come off easily, and a way of speaking softly that made the more impulsive ones pay attention without realizing it, as if authority came more from fatigue and steadiness than from any pose. On the makeshift scoreboard, someone had written the date in chalk, June 17th, and the chalk was already starting to crumble in the humidity. No one needed to be reminded what year it was. The year was in everything stuck to conversations and silences. On the newspapers laid out on the pharmacy counter on Main Street, the headline spoke of a truce in Korea, of arguments in Washington, of tests and more tests, and the radio news repeated terms that had already become part of daily life. In the factories, orders fluctuated, and the rumor of cuts came as naturally as summer rain, in bursts that flooded gutters and left the air heavy afterward. The team sponsor, Warden and Sons, lived on contracts that came because of the war. Small parts, tools, adjustments, orders that depended on deadlines and inspections. And that night, old Mr. Warden sat with his wife in the front row, hands folded over his cane, with the posture of someone used to watching without mixing in. He was not a bad man. He was a man who did the math, and math, at that moment, had the chill of an order spreadsheet and a payroll sheet. The ball left the pitcher's hand with a short whistle, cutting through the hot air. The opposing batter connected on a low liner that skimmed past second base. The shortstop, a thin boy named Eddie Lance, dove and trapped the ball against his chest, kicking up a cloud of dirt that hung for an instant before settling. The bleachers let out a long, ah, then applause, dry claps from hands that had worked all day. Eddie got up slowly with a sideways smile, and Tom saw his knee bleeding, a red line running down his shin and darkening the dust. Eddie had been on the team since the feeder group, when he was still 12 and the uniform was too big, with rolled sleeves and an improvised belt. Now he was 17 and carried a kind of hurry that frightened people. Tom knew that hurry. The hurry of boys who saw the future as a narrow door and thought they had to run through it before someone closed it. After the game, a tight win, 6-5, the boys gathered near the fence to hear what Tom had to say, leaning on the wire, breathing hard, some with hands on their knees. Mr. Warden came over looking at the ground, as if searching for a lost nail or a flaw he could fix. He spoke low and brief, without detours, like someone delivering hospital news, with the same care not to promise what he could not deliver. Warden and Sons would end the sponsorship at the end of July. The main contract with the supplier tied to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton would not be renewed as expected, and that meant fewer orders, fewer hours, and less room for expenses that were not essential. Whatever money remained had to go to keeping the house in order, an expression that there meant keeping machines running, paying wages and bills, and getting through what looked like a change in the cycle. If the team wanted to continue, it would have to find another name to stitch onto the shirts, and that included not only the fabric, but the cost of having letters made, replacing pieces, and maintaining a minimum appearance against opponents who arrived in new uniforms. No one argued, because no one knew how to argue with a fact. What could be heard was the scrape of a shoe in the dirt and the sound of a soda bottle being set down, glass against hard ground. Mr. Warden touched Tom's shoulder and said he was sorry, that it was a shame that the team had brought pride. Then he left with slow steps, as if the field had grown steeper, and as if each step carried the weight of a decision made in an office, not in the bleachers. Tom watched his back until the gate. Beside him, Ruth Kowalski, who kept the scorebook and sold hot dogs at games to pay for travel, closed a metal cash box where she kept coins, a box worn with use, and dented at the corners. Ruth was 28, worked as a switchboard operator at the Ohio Bell Exchange in shifts that demanded continuous attention and a controlled voice, and she had a precision people needed. She was not a player's wife or anyone's sister there. She was present by choice, and that sometimes bothered men who preferred everything in its proper place, with roles clearly defined. That night she said nothing. She only shut the box with a click that sounded final, like a time clock at the end of shift. In the days that followed, Springfield kept its summer routine, but the team carried a quiet urgency, as if every practice and every conversation came with a deadline. Tom went door to door. He started on East Main Street, where the shops and small businesses were. Mr. Klein's barber shop, the tire store, a Polish market that sold dark bread and sausage, products that recalled the origins of part of the neighborhood. He went in with his cap in his hand, talked about the team, the feeder group, the boys who came from the tighter neighborhoods where yards were small and the street became an extension of the house. He asked for little, a monthly check, a name painted on the back of the team truck, help buying uniforms, paying registration, and keeping the minimum equipment. Some said they would think about it. Others smiled with pity. There was a new weariness in the city. People had helped during the war, and then during Korea, with donations, raffles, and bond purchases, but now they want to hold on to what they had because the future felt less secure than the optimistic advertisement suggested. Ruth organized a list of company names and contacts. She knew the city's voices because she spent her day connecting calls, a manager asking for a line to Dayton, a wife calling her sister in Columbus, a man looking for the hospital, and also short work messages, transfer requests, urgencies that could not wait. She wrote everything down in a firm hand on paper already creased from folding. Crosley Plant, Navistar, Kettering Field Rep, Chamber of Commerce. On paper, the lines looked promising. In real life, each name came with an invisible wall made of hierarchy, caution, and priorities that did not include neighborhood team. The wall appeared when Tom and Ruth went to the right places and were met with smiles that did not reach the eyes. At the Chamber of Commerce office near Fountain Avenue, a man in a light suit explained that there were many requests, and that the moment was sensitive, the language of someone who needed to refuse without making enemies. He spoke of patriotism as if it were a coin worn too thin, as if the word no longer opened doors automatically. He suggested they try something tied to veterans, the VFW, the American Legion. Tom had already tried. The veterans supported the team with presents and beer, with the kind of solidarity that fit in a pocket and a weekend, but not with enough money to carry an entire season, pay travel, and keep the field in shape. What no one said openly, but everyone felt, was that military money had drawn a secret map in and around Springfield. There were those who had bought a new house on the road to Enon, those who had traded their car for the year's model, those who had expanded a shop because the demand wasn't going to end, trusting in contracts and promises of continuity. There were also those who stayed on the same peeling porch, counting pennies for coal in winter, hoping the extra work would hold, and looking with suspicion at anyone who seemed to have risen too fast. The team had always been a place where these worlds touched. A factory worker's son playing beside a manager's nephew, a Catholic boy from the east side running bases while a Baptist boy from the west side took fly balls in the outfield. Now, with the search for a sponsor, the differences the game used to disguise began to surface out loud in comments that had once stayed lodged at the back of the throat. On Thursday, July 2nd, 1953, Ruth convinced Tom to go to Dayton. Through a call at the exchange, she had gotten the name of a secretary who worked for a supplier tied to Wright-Patterson. If there was money that did not disappear, she said, it was that money, and Tom did not disagree because he knew how the base drove orders, inspections, and deadlines. They left early in a used Plymouth that Tom kept running with patches and care, alert to noises and leaks like someone who could not afford a breakdown. The morning air smelled of cut grass and gasoline, a common mix on streets where mowers worked early and cars warmed up before taking the road. Dayton felt more hurried than Springfield. On US 68, trucks passed carrying boxes and crates, and the Wright-Patterson sign appeared like a reminder of the country's size and the weight of a military installation in the local economy. They did not enter the base. They went to a commercial building across the way where a parts company had offices with a clean reception area and furniture that looked newer than Springfield's. The secretary received them politely, but with a distance that was not personal. It was part of the uniform, part of a way of keeping everything in order. She led them to a room where a young man with neatly combed hair spoke about compliance and corporate image, terms that sounded like barriers before they even became an answer. He asked how many spectators the team drew, what the demographics were, whether there was press coverage. Ruth answered with honest numbers, 50, 100 on good days, a small note in the Springfield News-Sun when there was a tournament. The man nodded the way someone listens to a child recite something. In the end, he said the company was re-evaluating community investments due to the possible signing of an armistice in Korea, as if peace there meant immediate pullback and caution. On the way back, the car radio crackled with news from Panmunjom. Words like final negotiations and prisoners, and the announcer's voice sounded far away, as if it came from another country. Tom drove with both hands firm, looking at the road as if it could provide an answer, attentive to trucks and passing maneuvers. Ruth, in the passenger seat, held the folder of papers on her lap and felt a weight that was not only frustration. She knew people who had lost brothers in the war, knew widows still waiting for letters and news, and understood how waiting ate away at a person. And yet there they were, depending on a thread of money that came from a machine larger than all of them, a faceless machine that owed nothing to a dirt field. On July 10th, on a stifling night, Tom gathered the team in the basement of St. Raphael Church on the east side, a place that smelled of weak coffee and floor wax, with walls that held dampness and insufficient ventilation. There were folding tables and metal chairs that squeaked when someone shifted. The boys arrived in work shirts, some still with grease under their nails and dust marks on their faces. Among them was Eddie Lance, restless, tapping his foot without stopping, as if his body did not know how to be still. Harold Hal Mertens was there too, the catcher and the de facto leader when Tom was not looking. Hal was 21, worked in a railroad freight depot in a routine of loading, checking, and schedules that did not forgive lateness, and he had a calm that seemed learned by force, like someone who had seen enough not to waste energy on shouting. Tom explained the situation without dramatizing it. He said that without sponsorship, there would be no registration for the regional tournament in August in Xenia. There would not be enough balls, and the field might be given to another group because space and night lighting were contested. Ruth showed the list of attempts, the closed doors, the vague replies. And then, inevitably, someone asked what no one wanted to ask. Why some teams in other towns got sponsorship easily, with new uniforms and guaranteed transportation. The answer came from Eddie's side. Too loud. He said he knew why. He said the teams that had sponsorship were the ones useful for advertising, the ones with the name of a company that sold to the government, the ones with connections. He said connections as if it were a synonym for a kind of people, a closed circle. Some boys agreed with murmurs. Others shifted uncomfortably because they had relatives who worked in those places and because the line between criticism and accusation was too thin for a church basement. Hal raised a hand, asking for calm, but Eddie had already gone far. He looked at Tom and Ruth and said there was no point asking those who had always been on the outside. He said the team should go after those who had truly profited from the war, and he named a company that landed in the basement like a heavy object. Marston Aeronautics, a smaller firm headquartered in Dayton, but with an office in Springfield near the station, where the movement of people and paper was constant. People said they had gotten contracts through connections at Wright-Patterson. People said the owner, a man named Frank Marston, had bought a large house in Ridgewood and sent his son to a private school. Visible signs of a kind of prosperity that did not go unnoticed in a mid-sized town. Tom did not like rumors, but he knew that in a mid-sized town, rumor was a crooked form of truth, a way of recording what did not make the newspaper. He also knew that if they went after Marston, they would walk into a room where the team would be seen as something to use, not something to care for. Still, the alternative was to end, and ending meant losing more than a schedule of games. On Monday, July 13th, 1953, Tom and Ruth went to Marston's office in Springfield. The building was red brick with a new, shiny sign, and the entrance had the kind of cleanliness that gave away recent paint and constant maintenance. The hallway smelled of fresh paint and new paper. A man at reception made them wait longer than necessary, reading a newspaper without looking up, as if their time was worth less because they had no title and no tie. When they finally went in, Frank Marston did not look like a villain. He looked like a busy man. He was in his 50s, with an immaculate white shirt and a watch that flashed when he moved his hand, a flash that drew attention by contrast with factory and shop hands. He listened to the proposal with calculated interest. He asked questions about visibility, about the regional tournament, about how many boys with a future were on the team, as if the team were also a catalog of labor. When Ruth mentioned the base, the younger players, the ones from families without much, he smiled at one corner of his mouth. He said he liked to invest in youth. Then came the price, delivered as if it were a reasonable suggestion. Yes, he would sponsor them, but he wanted the team to carry the name Marston Aeronautics, and on game days, he wanted 2 or 3 boys to hand out flyers about job opportunities in the industry, printed paper that cost little and bought presents. He also wanted a photo for the newspaper of him handing over the uniforms, and he wanted the team to play an exhibition at a fundraiser for a local civil defense committee, a term that in that period appeared on posters and in meetings, tied to sirens, instructions, and a diffuse anxiety. Tom listened and felt discomfort rise up the back of his neck. It was not illegal. It was not dirty in the obvious sense. It was an exchange that placed the team inside an image machine with obligations beyond the game. Ruth wrote the conditions down carefully because that was how she protected herself, by writing, recording what could later become a demand. When they left, the heat on the street felt heavier, as if the air had thickened. Tom said he needed to think. Ruth, holding the folder tight against her chest, said there might not be time to think because registration deadlines and supply purchases did not wait for reflection. The news spread quickly. In Springfield, people knew when someone went in and out of an important office, and they knew how to read signs in parking lots and hallways. The following week, there were more people than usual at the field behind South. Some came to watch the game. Others came to see whether the team would sell itself, as if the decision were a public moral test. Softball, suddenly, carried an argument that did not fit inside the chalk lines. And the chalk, for that matter, was applied sparingly, sometimes failing in spots where the dirt swallowed the mark. On Wednesday, July 22nd, 1953, the Armistice in Korea seemed imminent. The radio talked about it at every break, and the repeated words already had the tone of countdown. At International Harvester, Tom heard men commenting that overtime was going to end, and that without overtime the difference in the pay envelope was immediate. A supervisor said the factory needed to adjust, an expression that on the shop floor meant fewer shifts, reassignment, and uncertainty. Tom arrived at the field that night with his head full and found Eddie arguing with Hal near the bench. Eddie said accepting Marston was kneeling. Hal said it was surviving. Ruth, seated with the cash box, watched in silence, her eyes following every gesture like someone measuring consequences before they became facts. The game began tense. The opponent was a Dayton team sponsored by a transportation company. They had new uniforms, good gloves, and the kind of confidence that comes from equipment that does not fail. The air was humid, and heavy clouds gathered in the distance, promising rain that could stop the game and ruin the field. In the middle of the fifth inning, with the score tied, a commotion started outside the field near the cars parked in an uneven line. Two men were arguing loudly, and someone mentioned Marston. One accused the other of making money off blood. The word blood cut through the air and reached the infield like an odor, and for an instant the game seemed small beside what was being said. Tom tried to keep the game moving. He knew that if the team became a stage for a fight, it would lose any chance at decent sponsorship and any tolerance from the school district. But Eddie at shortstop had his jaw clenched. When a high ball was hit to left, Eddie ran back too fast, looking up, and did not see the hole near the fence where rain had washed away dirt, leaving a treacherous depression. His foot sank, his body twisted, and he went down with a dry crack that did not match the normal sound of a fall. The silence afterward was total, as if the whole city had held its breath, and even the distant hum of the highway seemed to pull back. Eddie tried to get up, but his right leg did not respond. His knee was at the wrong angle, and his face lost color. Hal ran over, knelt beside him, and held the boy's shoulder firmly, trying to prevent movement that would make it worse. Tom arrived and saw at once that it was not a scrape. Ruth dropped the cash box and came over, her shoes kicking up dust. Someone shouted for a doctor. A man ran to the nearest pay phone, because not everyone had a phone at home and there was no line available at the field. The ambulance took Eddie to Springfield City Hospital on North Fountain Avenue. Tom went along in the front seat, holding his cap between his fingers as if he could crush reality. At the hospital, the smell of disinfectant was strong, and the corridor had a cold echo, with footsteps that sounded louder than they should. Eddie's mother arrived with her hair pinned up in haste, her face tight. His father, who worked shifts, came later with his shirt open at the collar, eyes red with fatigue and shock, like someone pulled from a place of noise and heat into a white, impersonal hallway. The doctor spoke of ligaments, of fracture, of surgery. He said Eddie probably would not play the way he had before. The words were delivered professionally, but they landed like a domestic sentence because the effect was not abstract. It was work, future, identity. Eddie was a boy who defined himself by a body in motion, running, diving, hitting the ball. Taking that away was not only taking away a hobby. It was tearing out part of the path he imagined for himself, at a time when amateur sport was also discipline, belonging, and sometimes the only thing that felt truly his. That night became an irreversible point, and the team felt it as if it had lost a central piece. In the days that followed, the field seemed emptier even when people were there, because Eddie's absence had physical weight. The conversations about sponsorship grew quieter, as if it were indecent to talk about money when a boy lay with his leg immobilized. But life did not stop out of delicacy. The bills continued, the tournament calendar drew closer, and Mr. Warden held to his decision. The Armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, and in Springfield the news arrived as relief accompanied by fear. Some celebrated. Others stayed quiet, thinking about what would happen when the city was no longer needed for war, when orders and contracts shrank and adjustment became reality. Tom went to the hospital to visit Eddie on the afternoon of July 30th. The room had a window looking out on a parking lot where the heat made the asphalt shine and the air felt still. Eddie was pale, his hair stuck to his forehead. Old magazines lay on the table, and a tray of barely touched food. Hospital food that rarely stirred appetite. Tom sat in the chair beside the bed. He did not talk about sponsorship. He talked about the game, the play before the fall, as if retelling it could give it meaning, as if the sequence of seconds could be rearranged. Eddie listened, eyes fixed on the ceiling like someone trying not to think about what came next. At some point, Eddie said, his voice tight, that he did not want the team to accept Marston out of pity for him. He did not want to be used as an example in a newspaper photo, an injured boy who needed saving. He wanted the team to be theirs, not a man's in a suit. The words came out in short sentences, as if each one cost energy, and as if his body, worn down by pain and medicine, allowed only what was essential. Tom left the hospital with a weight in his chest and a clarity he had not had before. The team could not continue the old way, depending on a single sponsor tied to military money that rose and fell with distant decisions and war calendars. It also could not refuse any help out of pride, because pride did not pay for balls or registration, and it did not keep lights on atop wooden poles. There was a middle ground, but it required the team to change shape, and change always left people behind, especially those who preferred quick solutions and strong names. The following week, Tom and Ruth organized an open meeting at the VFW Post 1031 Hall on East Main Street on August 5, 1953. They announced it in a local paper and put up posters in grocery stores, pinned and taped wherever they could. The idea was simple and laborious. Turn the team into a community association with small contributions from many places instead of a single sponsor. They would ask $5 a month from shopkeepers, $1 a week from anyone who could, raffles on game days, food sales, and a small fee from players who had steady wages. For the feeder group boys and those who could not pay, there would be waivers. It would not be elegant, it would not make a big photo, but it could keep the team alive without tying the name to one company and without depending on a contract that could vanish with a signature on another continent. At the meeting, the hall smelled of stale beer and wood, with ventilation that could not handle the August heat. Flags hung on the wall and photos of men in old uniforms, reminders of other wars and other returns. Small shopkeepers came, some mothers, 2 teachers, and men who worked at companies that had profited from contracts also came, because no one was completely outside that circuit. Frank Marston did not appear, but he sent a representative, a man in a tie who stood in the back with arms crossed, the posture of someone observing to report later. Tom spoke little and plainly. Ruth presented numbers, costs, the dates of the tournament in Xenia, and what each item meant in real money, not in intention. She spoke with the steady voice of someone who spent her day connecting people and knew that in the end, everything depended on fragile lines, pennies added up, and commitments kept. When the floor opened, an older man said he did not trust passing the hat. Another said it was that or nothing. A woman from the east side, who worked washing laundry for others, put 2 crumpled bills on the table and said it was what she had. A respectful silence formed, not out of sentimentality, but because everyone understood the concrete effort in that gesture, the cost of giving up money that already had a destination. When Marston's representative spoke, he offered the sponsorship on the old terms, as if it were a favor still on the table, and as if speed were the final argument. He said the company could solve everything quickly. Tom thanked him and said the team had decided to take another path. There was no dramatic applause, only a murmur of surprise and, on some faces, relief. On others, irritation. Because refusing Marston was not only refusing money, it was refusing entry into a circle some were already in and others would never be invited to, and that disturbed local hierarchies many people preferred not to name. The consequence came quickly, discreet, and hard. The next week, the field behind South received a notice. Nighttime use would be limited due to maintenance and energy costs. It was not a total ban, but it was a tightening, and tightenings like that were rarely neutral. Tom suspected someone had made calls, applied pressure, using channels that did not appear on paper. Ruth at the exchange heard sideways comments and calls that passed through. One man saying that coach thinks he's better than everyone, another saying if he won't take help, let him disappear. The city had a way of punishing without leaving visible marks, with small restrictions that looked administrative. Even so, the community plan began to work. Not like a miracle, but like the sum of small things recorded and collected. Mr. Klein's barbershop gave $5. The Polish market gave $3 and a box of bread to sell at the game. A gas station offered a discount on fuel because fuel was a direct cost on short, repeated trips. The VFW lent the hall for raffles. Ruth organized food sale shifts and wrote down every cent in a blue-covered notebook with dates, amounts, and names as if it were survival bookkeeping. Tom, exhausted, trained the team earlier, using daylight to avoid energy fees and adjusted practices to what the field allowed, steering around holes and looser patches. Eddie, his leg in a cast, showed up sometimes on crutches, sat near the dugout, and helped as he could, keeping notes on plays, running the scoreboard, doing what his body allowed. His face hardened over time, but there was also a new maturity, as if a still body had forced the mind forward. Some boys, seeing Eddie there, stopped complaining about small aches. His fall became a fixed point in the team's memory, a reminder that nothing was guaranteed. Not a knee, not a field, not money. On Saturday, August 22nd, 1953, the team went to Xenia for the regional tournament even without new uniforms. The gray shirts still bore traces of the name Warden and Sons, faded letters that Ruth had tried to cover with darker blue paint, forming a new simple name, Springfield Community. It was not a brand. It was a statement of origin, made with what was on hand. They traveled in separate cars because there was no bus, coordinating times as best they could. They brought iced chests with sandwiches, bottles of water, and a bag with a counted number of balls, because losing a ball on someone else's field meant losing money. The day was clear with a light wind. The field in Xenia was better kept, trim grass, crisp white lines, and the difference in maintenance showed in the ball's bounce and the firmness underfoot. They played 2 games. They won the first with effort and lost the second by a little. They did not bring home a big trophy. They did bring back a concrete sense that they still existed, that the team was not only a name on a shirt. When they returned to Springfield at dusk, the cars entered the city by the same road, as always, passing identical houses, poles, stores closing, and people sitting on porches to catch cooler air. Life looked unchanged, but the team knew it had crossed a point of no return because it had proved it could sustain itself without a single owner. At the end of September, Warden & Sons officially removed its name from the team, as promised. Mr. Warden showed up at one last home game, stood for a few minutes, then left before the end. There was no fight, no formal reconciliation. It was simply the way a man accepted that the world had changed and that he needed to protect what was his in a period when small businesses felt the swing of orders first. The tool factory reduced shifts. At International Harvester, Tom saw co-workers reassigned. In some houses, lights went out earlier to save money. Military money, which had flowed like a strong current, now receded, leaving things exposed along the bank, including resentments and fragilities that over time had once covered. The Springfield community team kept playing into the fall until the cold began to bite hands. When the ball fell harder and the air cut, Ruth put the blue-covered notebook away in a drawer with receipts and lists, as if they were documents from a small local war fought with coins and persistence. Eddie began physical therapy and, months later, walked without crutches again, but his knee never bent with the same confidence. He stopped running bases and, the next summer, helped coach the younger ones, teaching them to dive carefully and to respect the field as if it had a will of its own, because holes in uneven ground did not forgive haste. In the spring of 1954, when the first rains left the smell of wet earth in the air and the field began to mark shoes again, Tom opened the cabinet where he kept the shirts and saw the crooked letters, the darker blue over the faded blue, and felt something close to peace. It was not victory, it was continuity. The team was no longer a company's showcase, nor did it depend on a distant contract. It was something more fragile and more real, made of coins in a metal box, of bread sold, of men and women giving what they could without expecting a photograph, and also of a leg that cracked on a hot July night and changed a boy's fate and the way a group understood its own place. In the last game of the summer of 1954, on an evening when the sun sank slowly over Limestone Street and the air began to ease, Eddie sat at the end of the bench holding a clipboard and watched a 12-year-old from the feeder group run to first base with his face open in joy. Tom, near the third base line, raised his hand and made a simple adjustment signal, the economical gesture of someone who had learned to lead without waste. Ruth, behind the improvised table, counted coins calmly and closed the box at the end with the same familiar click. The field lights still trembled in the wind, the fence still had holes, and the city still carried the marks of money that came and went with wars and decisions far away. But that night the sound of the ball meeting the glove was clean and enough, and when everyone left, leaving footprints in the dirt that would soon disappear, the field grew quiet like a place that had done its job, holding in silence the memory of a time when a team nearly ended and, through organized stubbornness, learned to exist in another way. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.